Welcome to the Westmonster News Podcast, your alternative to the mainstream media.
It's fair to say that one of the top issues in the country and the defining issue of the Brexit referendum was the issue of immigration. However, some in Westminster still prefer not to talk about it. Well, I've got a real expert with me on the Westminster News Podcast today. It's Dr. Ben Greening, the Executive Director of Migration Watch UK. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Good man. Yeah, no, good. I think this is an issue that people do really care about, but there's been a real reluctance by some, even now, to talk about what is going on in terms of our borders. So, first of all, I just wanted to ask about Migration Watch and your role.
Yeah, so Migration Watch was set up in 2001, and we are a think tank. We're a research body. We're an independent and non-partisan organization. And for 19 years, we've been a leading voice in making the facts known as widely as possible and in making suggestions as to how immigration might be reduced. And what we do is we speak for the 30 million people in the country that we know support a reduction in immigration. That's a clear majority of the UK public.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair to say, and we've seen it every time there's been opinion polls. We've seen that a clear majority in the UK think the level of migration has been too high and they want it reduced. Why do you think that hasn't happened? Because we've had a lot of promises over the years, but actually, if you look at the levels, it's still way in to the hundreds of thousands net per year.
That's right. Yeah. So the most recent statistics show that net migration, the overall net migration is 270,000 in the last year, 2019. But actually, that net figure covers a lot of detail, which shows that the actual the level of non-British immigration to the UK is at the highest level it's ever been. And so you have to wonder, after all of these years of promises, why that is still the case. And it's unfortunately because too often the voices of the public, of normal, ordinary, hardworking people, are ignored by very powerful interests that are in favour of keeping immigration high.
Now, your colleague Alp Mehmet wrote a piece for Westminster, and he addressed the problem of illegal immigration. He pointed out that the number of people arriving at the moment means we're on course to reach at least 7,500 in 2020, i.e. 5,000 more people arriving illegally from safe countries by Christmas. This is via the boats that are coming across the channel. How do you assess that issue at the moment? Because it seems to me that it's getting worse and worse.
Yeah, what we have there is a very visible and flagrant example of illegal crossings of these people who are coming from safe countries and making a very dangerous crossing, often at the behest and encouragement of criminal traffickers who profit from dangerous and deadly journeys like that. But that is a worsening problem. And obviously we've seen since the start of 2020 about 2,400 people coming in that way, even after we spent £114 million of taxpayers' money to France in order to stop the problem since 2015. Clearly, it's getting worse. It's not getting better. And the government has some very tough words on it. But what we have not seen is effective action to stop it. But it's worth mentioning that channel issue, as visible and as annoying and frustrating as it is just a small part of a bigger picture of illegal immigration in the country. There was a recent estimate by Pew Research which showed that there's between 800,000 and 1.2 million illegal immigrants in the country as a whole. And we know that from research, for instance, former Home Office senior personnel say that the illegal population may be increasing by a gross total of 150,000 to 250,000 a year. And we've done some other research which suggests slightly less than that, about 70,000 a year net, but still quite a lot, going up every year by tens of thousands at least. That is through three main channels. That's through clandestine entries and illegal crossings, such as these channel crossings. There's also asylum seekers who sometimes, when their claim is denied and they're actually meant to leave the country, they do not. So that's another source. And then the biggest channel for illegal immigration into the country is overstaying by people who come here as visitors, actually.
I mean, we did a story on Westminster that sort of a lot of people were shocked by. That the Home Office, it came out recently, the Home Office doesn't actually know how many illegal migrants are in the UK, and that they haven't done an up-to-date estimate even in 15 years. The last estimate made in 2005 suggested there were about 430,000 people in the country with no right to remain, and they say that the estimated demand for immigration enforcement activity is put between 240,000 and 320,000 cases per year. Ben, how can it be that the Home Office hasn't even done any real analysis or estimate since 2005? What is going on here?
Yeah, it's very puzzling. What I suspect is that analysis has been done internally. It's just not been published because they realized that the last time they did publish it back in the mid 2000s, it didn't do the government any favors because it doesn't make them look good if there's hundreds of thousands of illegal migrants. Clearly, that number, which they put it at 500,000 in the mid 2000s, is much higher now. And there was a former Director General, head of immigration enforcement, called David Wood, who said that internal estimates by the Home Office, as I said, show that illegal immigration is increasing by a gross total of between 150,000 and 250,000 a year. So you can only imagine what the numbers might be. Our estimate suggests over 1 million. Former top Home Office officials suggest over 1 million. Pew Research suggests over 1 million. But what we really need now is for the Home Office to actually do what they're paid to do and inform the public in a balanced and accurate as possible manner what the scale of this problem is, because 77% of the public say illegal immigration is a serious problem.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's I've seen it myself on Westmont, so there's a lot of public interest in terms of our borders, in terms of policing them properly, and in terms of enforcement. I mean, what do you, Migration Watch, think needs to be done when it comes to dealing with illegal migration that the government aren't doing at the moment?
Well, one thing they could start by doing is giving our excellent and hardworking border personnel the resources that they need and the support that they need to do their job. And government recently just said that in the context of the channel crossings, they said enforcement will always have the resources they need to tackle these crossings. But the fact of the matter is that enforcement has seen a drop of 11% real term reduction in its resource budget since 2015-16, about £47 million. And there's this startling quote by a union boss, the union boss who's head of the Union for Immigration Enforcement Staff, who said that those here without permission have very little chance of being caught because of the swathe of cuts that the budget has seen. So that's just one part of it. But the other thing that we would like to see, and we argue for repeatedly, is an increase in enforcement action to remove those people who are here without permission back to where they come from.
Okay, now just turning to legal migration. As I said earlier, there's been repeated promises over the years to bring down levels of migration. Of course, David Cameron made the famous tens of thousands net migration pledge. And of course, now we've left the European Union. There's an immigration bill that's gone through Parliament. All of these things, public support for bringing numbers down. But at the moment, how do you assess the government's immigration policy in terms of where they're heading, what they're saying? Do you think they're going to be bringing down numbers seriously?
No, the government's immigration plan risks not bringing immigration numbers down from the numbers seen before the coronavirus crisis, and risks actually increasing numbers. The other thing it does is it is a threat to British workers, because immigration, as we know, can displace UK workers. There was a report done by the official expert committee on immigration, which found that 160,000 British workers had been displaced by migrant workers between 1995 and 2010. And there's a greater risk of this happening during a downturn. So this risk's happening on a much greater scale now.
How do you respond to those who say, actually, the more migration we have, the better it is for the economy, that this doesn't affect housing, that it has no impact on infrastructure? I mean, you seem to hear this a lot on telly. It seems completely illogical to me. But what's your response to that in terms of the economic side of this?
Well, how can a immigration-driven population growth of 400,000 a year not have an impact on public services? How can it not increase congestion and crushing queues on trains and buses? How can it not increase demand massively for housing, which we know is already in shortage, and we know young people are already struggling to own their own home and get on the housing ladder? How can it not mean the loss of our green countryside to ever increasing development? It's blatantly obvious that it will have an impact, and it's always very strange to witness the immigration industry trying to try and twist the truth, essentially, and suggesting that it doesn't have an impact, because normal people know that it does.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about these interests. I mean, what's going on here? Is this big business wanting to have an endless supply of cheap labour? Is it in terms of the housing market? I mean, what are those interests that you think are really putting on pressure behind the scenes to keep mass migration going?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There was a Labour speechwriter who admitted that the deliberate policy of the government in the early 2000s had been to open the country to mass immigration, and that's exactly what happened. So we've seen the non-UK born population increase by about 4 million since 2004. So the UK was opened up to much higher levels of immigration than it had ever seen before. Of course, it's reached even higher record levels of 1/3 of a million this decade. And there's a range of different pressures for that. On one part, it's big business, which is keen to ensure their steady flow of cheaper workers from overseas. They had a large pool of workers in this regard from EU free movement, and because free movement is being ended, the immigration industry was keen that the tap of cheaper labor continues. So instead of doing what we suggested in maintaining the very robust checks on work permits to ensure that we have high skilled people coming in at high wages and ensure high productivity, what the government has done is essentially take on a blueprint for a Tony Blair style New Labour global immigration bonanza, which will mean, by uncapping work permits and also by loosening the student route, will mean much higher numbers from outside the EU, which is anathema to, as I said, 30 million people who want a reduction.
Finally, this issue clearly gets buried time and time again, but I think ordinary people can see the level of migration has been too high. Number one, what do you think a sensible level of net migration is? And two, what would the benefits be to people and society in the country if the level of migration was brought down to that sort of sensible level?
Well, lower immigration, essentially more carefully controlled immigration, would, in our view, lead to a better economy and a fairer society. It would mean that wages have more chance of rising. It would mean that we don't lose our green fields to overdevelopment, or we lose them at a slower pace at least, which is a good start. And we want to protect as much of our countryside as possible. Too often you don't hear the environmentalists talking about immigration with regard to the environment, because it's not fashionable to do so. But what we want to see is the views of the majority respected. We want to see pressure eased on our vital public services. We want to ensure that the population growth is stabilized at a sustainable level. That you asked me what level immigration would ideally be. There's a ONS population projection which shows that if net migration was reduced to below 100,000 as promised by the previous Conservative government, it would stop our population from hitting 70 million, which is what it is on course to do in a very short period of time now. So that would be a start. Bring the net migration level down to below 100,000. Now, it may do that as a result of the coronavirus crisis and the lockdown and the economic impact of all that. It may actually do that for a very short period, but the problem is that the government is now setting in place a blueprint which will affect immigration for the next few decades, and that blueprint has to be absolutely spot on. But the trouble is that the Home Office itself admits that this blueprint would lead to or could lead, and these estimates are subject to a number of significant limitations, but they suggested that it could increase the number of workers and families by 15 to 50,000 a year, and a new graduate route for allowing students to work in unskilled work, for instance, would lead to a net rise in student immigration by 20 to 25,000 per year. We've also had a promise of a new route for people, up to 3 million people, to work and study here from Hong Kong and gain citizenship. Boris Johnson's also talked about expanding the youth mobility scheme, which allows young people 18 to 30 years old from the EU, which would allow young people 18 to 30 years old to come from the EU to work in jobs at any skill level, and that could lead to an increase in numbers too.
And finally, we've had a point made by Ian, one of our patrons over at Westmonster.club. Thanks a lot, Ian. He's basically making the point that regarding UK border controls, it's not about frontline measures necessarily in his view. It's more about the pull factors. And it's also about the legal system we need a legal system that is willing to enforce deportation, along with a review of benefits that illegal migrants are entitled to. What's your view on that in terms of those pull factors?
The pull factors in immigration are very clear. Most of the pull factor is to do with income differentials. That's what we saw when it came to free movement. People were very willing to come in large numbers from countries such as Romania and Bulgaria, which had much lower income levels. And that's the main draw. And also it's a relatively free, relatively prosperous, relatively safe society, and English language is a big attraction too. The benefit claims, especially in the context of free movement, were a much more minimal factor in that regard. But I know that it is one of the main concerns of the public. If you ask people what they think are the main costs of immigration, they talk about the fact that they think immigrants sometimes come here to claim benefits, but that's not what we saw in terms of free movement, and it's also not necessarily true in terms of non-EU immigration too, because at the moment there's a no recourse to public funds condition of people who come in on visas, so they can't claim benefits for at least 5 years.
Well, look, fascinating insight for Dr. Ben Greening. I hope we can have you on again soon. As I said, this is an issue that some still want to ignore and bury, but we at the Westmonster News Podcast are going to keep highlighting this, and we hope to have you on again soon. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.